Good evening, everyone. Sorry for the delay and the technical difficulties, but we will begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. We thank you, Lord, for bringing us together this evening. We ask you, as we reflect upon the land of Italy, to be aware of the abundant ways you have blessed your church, and help us to live actively as members of that church through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. I apologize if you can't hear me. We had to shut off our microphone. Feel free to move closer if you need to. And this talk, like the first one, there's no way I can come close to covering the things that I saw in 4 years in Italy. Just some of them. I'm not even going to talk tonight about Florence or Bagnoregio, which you see on the right side there. Bagnoregio is where St. Bonaventure grew up, and Florence is one of the most beautiful cities in Rome. But just some of the highlights of some of the opportunities that were there, things that were definitely worth seeing. In Rome, of course, you have layers of history. The city goes back to 753 BC, according to the legends of the founding of Rome. So being over 2,700 years old, you have layers of history. So many of the buildings have ancient foundations that are over 2,000 years old, and then newer additions and renovations. Here I am at the Roman Forum, and we had a great tour of that forum in Rome. It's important to have a good tour guide. So many of the Italian tour guides are, well, somewhat annoying and inept. So they have really loud, obnoxious umbrellas or some other object that they hold up so that you follow them, and usually a very thick accent, and they've read 1 or 2 books, and then they tell you what they think they know about history, and often distort it. We had a very excellent guide that day, and that made all the difference. I love ancient history to start with. I don't have time to go through all the ancient sites in Rome, but just a couple of myths that are commonly put out there. If you ever go to Rome and go on a tour, you might be told some of these things, and it's worth knowing what really happened. One thing that a lot of tour guides today will say, the Christians after Constantine felt threatened by Rome's pagan past and did their best to destroy all memory of it. You'll hear that, and in fact, a lot of people get angry about this. They accuse the Catholic Church of being intolerant and destructive, and talk about how religion is a bad influence that causes violence and wars and conflict, and is anti-intellectual, anti-culture, and so on and so forth. We've heard these things. Well, when we think about this just for a moment, if this in fact is what those early Christians were trying to do, they really did a lousy job, because you go around Rome and you see signs of pagan ancient Rome all over the place. They really didn't destroy it very well at all. And think about that. And with historical context, we get to appreciate a little bit about what really happened during those later years of the Roman Empire in the West, and the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, and the subsequent years in Rome. Pope Gregory the Great, who first was prefect of Rome in his younger years, encountered a very challenging situation in his hometown where his family was from. We don't realize this, but Rome really hit a low point. Somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 people. We think of this vast city, but it really was quite tiny when he ruled it. And that there were all these, where there used to be palaces and homes up on the hills lying in ruins, goats grazing about, and so many things that have been destroyed, pillaged, and sacked, and raided over the years preceding when he took over. Lots of challenges. In fact, we can look at this and say, where else in the world can you find these antiquities so well preserved? Most parts of the world, they had ancient cultures, but that stuff is long gone. It's on the ash heap of history. There are no more signs of these things. They've been lost. But actually, because the church had such an influence in Rome, you still can cherish and enjoy and benefit from these things today. So what did happen? What did the early Christians do after Constantine? Did they destroy things? Well, no question, they did destroy many idols. There was a concern about worshiping false gods. worshiping demons, and so idols were often destroyed. And some temples, yes, were closed, particularly the temple of Jupiter that was atop the Capitoline Hill. We get our word capital from Capitoline, there in the Capitol in Rome. Was this, this hill, and we have Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., so on and so forth. But if you ever go there and you stand in the forum and you look up, or if you see drawings of what it was like, or if you stand atop the Capitoline Hill and look down on the forum, you can see how this temple loomed over everything in public life. And having this temple to the sky god looming over your everyday life just wouldn't work. So that change did have to be made. In many cases, what the Christians did was repurpose these buildings, for lack of a better word. These pagan worship sites, they kept intact for the most part and turned them into Christian worship sites. That was a common thing to do. This is bitterly opposed by some, but we'll see actually the good that it did. The classic example is the Pantheon, which was in honor of all the gods, and now it's St. Mary of the Angels, and it has been for many hundreds of years. And people that go there today and they get angry, how dare the Catholic Church take over this beautiful pagan temple and force their own religion on it. Our tour guide pointed out, it wouldn't be standing if that hadn't happened. What happened to all the other pagan temples in the ancient world? They're not here anymore. They've long since been destroyed and lost. And the early Catholics saw the beauty in the architecture and preserved that and directed it to the worship of the true God through Jesus Christ. It's hard to be too critical of that, and we still have this beautiful structure today because of those efforts. They did the same thing with Santa Maria sopra Minerva. That means literally on top of wisdom, Our Lady's seat of wisdom now, where formerly there had been a temple to the goddess of wisdom. So probably the model in these efforts is St. Gregory the Great, amazing pope. He wrote a letter to St. Augustine of Canterbury, to an abbot who was asking on behalf of St. Augustine of Canterbury. Gregory had sent Augustine to England to be a missionary, and Augustine had questions of what to do with some of the pagan temples up there that were used for Celtic worship and other kinds of worship. He said, tell Augustine that he should by no means destroy the temples of the gods, but rather the idols within those temples. Let him, after he has purified them with holy water, place altars and relics of the saints in them. For if those temples are well built, they should be converted from the worship of demons to the service of the true God. Thus, seeing that their places of worship are not destroyed, the people will banish error from their hearts and come to the places familiar and dear to them in acknowledgement and worship of the true God. Now, this is a very interesting letter. It's often quoted today in discussions of evangelization and enculturation when we discuss how do you deal with issues that come up in evangelizing cultures today, where there's a tendency historically among a lot of missionaries just to completely squash the culture and impose a European Western culture on top of it. And quoting Gregory and saying, no, don't destroy everything, keep what is good and convert it towards Christianity. He's very profound here, though. He has a clear sense of religion in that classical sense that we talked about last year as reconnecting us with the living God. Through Jesus Christ, we really have access to God, and that really matters. And he was deeply concerned that these people in England would have access to the living God through worshiping Jesus Christ. But he wanted to preserve all that was good and beautiful in their culture and not simply destroy everything. Also knowing that if they did destroy everything, that would turn people away from Jesus Christ. So he said, leave the temples, but you do have to destroy the idols and reconsecrate the altars, was the approach he encouraged Augustine of Canterbury to take. Then he goes on to talk about the animal sacrifices, these ritual sacrifices that they were offering at that time in England. And he said, yeah, they like to do that. Everybody likes a good party and gets to, eat this wonderful meat after sacrificing the animals. But let them do that, but connect it with Christian celebrations. And he's not necessarily liking the fact that they're having these ritual sacrifices, but he's trying to deal with it pastorally. And what he goes on to say is very profound. What often is called the law of graduality, step by step. He says, "For surely it is impossible to efface all at once everything from their strong minds. Just as when one wishes to reach the top of a mountain, he must climb by stages and step by step, not by leaps and bounds." This is profound for our everyday spiritual life, not to try to do too much at once, but just to go one step at a time and be patient to get to the top. But it also very much applies to missionary efforts. He wants to win over the people in England, and he does want them ultimately to stop these ritual sacrifices. He doesn't see that as a helpful thing in the long run, but he says he's willing to tolerate it for the time being, to bring them gradually. Not to become uniform in every way and exactly like the Romans. He's not saying to do that. But on the other hand, not to keep on in their pagan practices. It's a balance of affirming what is good, purifying what needs to be purified, and rejecting what is bad, and then gradually, step by step, bringing them along. That's a very good principle. Sometimes, whether it be with our children or with our students, or if we're trying to preach the gospel or witness to a coworker, sometimes we want to impose everything all at once. I think Pope Francis has been adopting this principle very much. He's encouraging us to focus first and foremost on the core of our faith and witness to that, and then introduce the other things and show people how they fit in. But if we try to clobber people with everything all at once, they're not going to respond well to that. And it's important to realize that. The results of taking this approach, what we see is, in fact, paganism did die out in Rome. You can't go to Rome and find ancient pagan Roman worship. I mean, you might find people attempting to do it today, but they have no idea what they're doing, and it's not the same as what was happening back then. That truly did die out. And yet, so many of these buildings and beautiful things that were there are still around, thanks to the efforts of the church preserving what was good. Keeping in mind that that was a difficult thing with all the invasions and the looting and pillaging. And for all that, you see what a vested interest the Catholic Church has in preserving culture and fostering beauty. So another myth that you hear a lot is, and I heard this one time walking past the Colosseum. I'm sorry to tell you, but contrary to popular belief, no Christians were killed here. That one day I wanted to turn and say, he's full of it, don't believe it. You'll hear this. And it really is a silly claim when you look at it, but it's become very trendy in the last couple decades. As Father Benedict Rochelle always said, and you were there? He used to always say that point about people who claim to know 2,000 years ago what happened. What happened with these authors, there are a couple scholarly books that made this conclusion that Christians were not actually put to death in the Colosseum. They were studying early documents about martyrdom and saying, well, there's no reference here to the Colosseum. It never says that anybody was killed in the Colosseum, so therefore must not have happened. And you know, these tour guides say, see, in this book it says that, you know, and they probably haven't even read the book, but we look at those martyrologies. In fact, they rarely ever mention any site of martyrdom. It's just not what they were concerned about when they wrote about the lives of the martyrs. They had a whole different focus. Their most important point was the witness that these men and women were giving. The word martyr means witness, as you know. And also, obviously, the church from early days kept track of the day. Was always important because liturgically we celebrate the feast day on which these martyrs went to heaven and gave their witness. But the place wasn't so important in those accounts. And we look at the Colosseum itself and what it was used for, how it functioned. It seems quite obvious that Christians would have been killed there. Here you see the inside of the Colosseum. A lot of people are often shocked at the appearance because it doesn't look like what it looks like in movies. The seats are no longer there. Those were typically made out of wood and they're gone. And they had a fake floor, and then underneath all these cells where animals or whatever else, whatever kind of scenery and props they were using could be brought up or brought down from the stage, basically, is what it was. And before that even, a lot of people don't realize this, but they had a man-made lake on that site. Nero, the wonderful emperor who had Christians as walking torches in his gardens to entertain him at night, lovely guy. He wanted to feel like he was at his coastal home when he was up on the hill in his golden house there, so he had them make a giant lake. And they had mock sea battles there and reenacted some of those battles, or had swimming displays, something like a mini Olympics out in front of his home there. That eventually was drained, and they built what is called the Flavian Amphitheater. Titus Vespasian is the general who became emperor. He's the one who conquered Jerusalem and obliterated it and brought back loot and plunder to Rome, unfortunately. And at this time, the government in Rome was getting more and more unstable, and these emperors wanted to win popular support. So the bread and circus thing always works, giving out free food, putting on free displays, and winning popularity that way, and the Colosseum was a way to do that. It's called the Colosseum because next to it was this Colossus of Nero, this giant statue, which we no longer have. Also a way to try, rather than having to rule all these outlying territories with an iron fist, it was easier to get them to want to pay tribute. So you bring them into Rome, you show them all these impressive structures, put on a show for them in the Colosseum, and they want to be part of this. And they like to send in their wealth every year and pay tribute. That was all part of it. By the way, a lot of these marble buildings in ancient Rome are not marble through and through. It was just the facades that were marble, but as far as anybody knew, the whole thing was. And Italian culture is still kind of like that. First impressions are very important in Italy. Doesn't necessarily have to be lasting substance as long as you make a good first impression, but it was like that in ancient Rome too. I never did well with first impressions there. But anyway, so as you saw in the photo, there are all these underground chambers which allowed them to bring up animals or gladiators or whatever else at convenient times, or to drop them back down with the appearance of being a normal sandy ground on which this stuff was happening. And every day in the morning, there was a simulation of, it was basic like putting on a zoo show for the guests with these exotic animals from the far reaches of the empire in their natural habitats. You can imagine how amazing this was, almost 2,000 years ago, having the scenery suddenly change before your eyes with the help of these trapdoors and all these animals that you've never seen before in your life coming out, and how that would wow the crowds. Then in the afternoon, for everybody's entertainment, executing the criminals, public executions. And then in the evening, the main event, the gladiators. So similar in some ways to modern sports, where they came in this underground tunnel and then made their way out and were very popular with the fans. But you see, in the afternoon, criminals were executed in the Colosseum. Christians were considered criminals. Keep that in mind. Because they refused to worship the emperor when they were demanded to do so, they were considered guilty of serious crimes at certain periods in Roman history, and would have been executed, very likely, at the Colosseum. Why not? Along with other sites. So St. Ignatius of Antioch, of course, is a famous case in point. He talks in his letters about how he's going to be fed to the lions, and he was. And you look at Rome, where else would this have happened? There are other martyrdom sites in Rome, and I liked to visit those. I mean, they are everyday sites like Piazza Navona, very popular piazza today with all kinds of touristy things. But back in the day, it was one of those horseshoe racetracks, and they also executed criminals there. St. Agnes and other martyrs gave their lives there. The Circus Maximus, probably thousands of Christians gave their lives there. There was a circus by where St. Peter's Basilica is, the Circus of Nero, where St. Peter gave his life. But with the lions, very likely that would have happened at the Colosseum. They had the facility for it. It just makes sense. Anybody who claims otherwise really is not looking at the full picture of history. So, moving on to the catacombs. There are many of them in Rome. Some of them go on for miles. and definitely a moving experience to visit there. It's not quite what we think. We've been told a lot of times that the Christians hid out there, during persecution, and this was where they were secretly worshiping and having Mass so that the Romans wouldn't catch everybody knew where the catacombs were. So they were known to be burial places for Jews and Christians who did not, who wanted to bury the bodies, unlike the Roman customs. So they were outside the city for sanitary purposes. The one that's really popular, St. Callistus, is interesting, but St. Priscilla really is the one worth visiting because it has some of the very earliest Christian art in it. And for that reason alone, it's so worth visiting. This here is one of the earliest images of Jesus Christ, the Good Shepherd. And beautiful to see that and see how early. We're talking 150s, most of these images, or mid 100s, mid 2nd century. So very early Christian art. This is the earliest known image of Mary with child. Hard to see, it's not in good shape, but so powerful to realize this is the earliest image we know of the Virgin Mary in art. Then there's other ones that have become, that have been taken up by revisionist historians. So some of the feminist groups have looked at this one and said, see, a woman priest. The early church had women priests. See her offering the sacrifice there. And here's 3 more women priests on the fresco. They said, now if you look closely at this one, you'll see, in fact, it's the 3 young men in the fire in the book of Daniel that were rescued, from the flames. It's quite obviously that. And both of these are depictions of victory, triumph, resurrection ultimately. And above this woman is this peacock, which was an early symbol of immortality and resurrection. And in fact, this is a popular conception that in the early church, this is how priests prayed at Mass with their arms wide extended. But actually in art, if you look at it, that is a sign of victory, resurrection, conquest. For example, if you see Mary depicted in terms of the Immaculate Conception, she's in prayer, she's supplicating, whereas if you see the Assumption, where she's raised to heaven and glory, her arms are extended in victory. And that's a theme that runs throughout Christian art. So people want to run with this in whatever direction they want to run with it, and they've tried to use it as an argument that the early church had female priests, but it doesn't hold water historically. One of my favorite traditions, favorite things that I had in Rome was the station churches, or stational churches. This is a great tradition in Rome going at least to the 400s. And some of you who are more advanced in years maybe have an old missal, and you look through that old Latin missal and see that each day of Lent has a station church attached to it. If you have one at home, you can check that out. And these are actual churches in Rome, and back in the day, the Christians each day traveled together to a different church in Rome. This especially flourished at the time of Gregory the Great. It's been revived recently. It's very beautiful, particularly by Americans. There is an English Mass each weekday in Lent at 7 o'clock at the appropriate station church. And the Germans have started it too now. They get the 8 o'clock time. They get 20 or 30 maybe on a good day, but the Americans get about 200, at least in early Lent. Then as Lent goes on, you start to have the crowd thin out a little bit as people get tired and it rains a lot. But each day a different church, and we walk together to that. Many of these are buildings that were built in the 300s originally, and they've gone through various renovations over the centuries. And even some of those predate the church and actually were sites of Christian worship in people's homes during persecution times. So these are special places to visit. Some of them are only open for these days of their station church. A lot of them have beautiful art, obviously. Churches in Rome often have magnificent art that would only be in a museum here. And so often special to visit because on that very site, in many cases, you have martyrs. To be on the sites of these martyrdoms at these churches, and often almost always having relics. Just about any station church in Rome or other churches, you go to a side altar here or there and you see this or that saint buried there. It's all over the place. You're surrounded by relics of the saints. And this definitely creeps people out, this practice of revering relics, keeping relics of the saints, the honor paid to their bodies, and then eventually spreading apart their bodies a little bit and sending small pieces of their bodies all over the world for being reverenced. This creeps a lot of Americans out. Here you see the holy right hand of St. Stephen of Hungary that I talked about a few weeks ago, that was temporarily stolen by an American soldier after World War II and then returned. But there really are a lot of explanations to relics. We look at history. As I mentioned, the catacombs were not a hiding place for the Christians, but they did say Mass over the tombs of the martyrs from the earliest centuries. They had such respect and reverence, especially, as I said, on the day that marked the anniversary of this martyr going to heaven, asking their prayers, wanting to be close to those martyrs. And in the catacombs, you can see this, where you see a tomb that was believed to be a martyr's tomb. Everybody wanted to be buried close to the martyr. I guess with the idea on Resurrection Day, they kind of grab on and have a free ride to heaven. I don't. But anyway, this is theological, though. This is not just an early practice, but constant practice, and one that fits in with our theology. So I skipped a point there that as the church extends throughout the world, and you don't have tombs of the martyrs everywhere, you still have that sense of offering Mass at the tomb of the martyrs, because in many of our altars, in the altar stone, we deposit relics of the saints, and still have that sense of being close to them, asking their prayers for us, praying together with them as we offer the sacrifice of the Mass. Theologically, we believe in the resurrection of the body. We believe that our bodies are good and holy, and that what we do with our bodies matters. And in the saints especially, we see the holiness of the body. Some of these miracles, no doubt, are made up or fabricated or forgeries. I don't deny that, but some of them are real. And you have saints who have bilocated, as like Jesus did in his resurrected body. Jesus walks with the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, and they get back, and then people are talking about how he was appearing to Simon at the same time. Resurrected bodies can bilocate. It seems that even in this life, those who are really holy, it seems, have properties of a heavenly body already, or begin to. Those saints who have had the stigmata, like Padre Pio, where we saw in him both bilocation and the stigmata that was fairly confirmed by modern witness, that showing heavenly signs already, because he had the stigmata, but it never caused him to bleed to death or die. And we've seen incorruptible bodies after death with the saints, all these kind of things that just are little pointers towards the resurrection of the body. And so we pay special attention to that. In Scripture, we see similar principles at work. There's that woman who wants to go, and if I just touch the tassel of Jesus' cloak, I'll be healed. And she is. Or in the Acts of the Apostles, St. Peter walks by, and these poor and lame, sick and lame come, and they just his shadow will pass over us, we'll be healed, and they are. There's nothing magical about his shadow or about Jesus' tassel. This is not superstition. This is a belief that God works through physical means, as he does in the sacraments, as he does in the whole person of a saint, body and soul. And so the bodies of the saints from the earliest days in the church have been given very special reverence. That seems odd at first to Americans, but it really does make sense. And it's really not odd, it's just that our culture has different values and priorities than Christians maybe ought to have. I showed this last year on eBay. I found this. If you wanted, for only $98,000, you could have Elvis Presley's cue stick. This too could be yours. And for those who are huge devotees about Elvis Presley, they would be so excited about the prospect of Elvis owned this. Maybe he even touched it a few times. For celebrities, we think it's amazing to have little mementos of them, little things that they touched or used. But when we do this for saints, people say, oh, that's weird. But, if saints are more important, why would it be weird? And in fact, a lot of the miracles, this is something I skipped earlier, but a lot of the miracles that are worked that are proof of a saint being a saint, where the Pope says, yes, we acknowledge this person is in heaven, are worked because of relics. Maybe they have a piece of Mother Teresa's cloak, and they place it on a cancer victim and pray that through her intercession he'll be healed. And if he is, this is a miraculous sign of Mother Teresa being in heaven. I have a friend in Washington, D.C. that I studied with. His sister was the final miracle for Saint Teresa Benedict of the Cross, Edith Stein. And the final miracle she needed was his sister being healed through a relic there. So, not through a relic, but the relic was the occasion for God to work the miracle. God works this way. Well, the stational churches, to get back to them, as I said, this practice of getting up early was a great discipline for Lent. Didn't always get excited about it, but it was very good to do every day. And sometimes it was only a block away. We were very central in Rome, but more often 20 to 25-minute walk together. It seemed like it rained a lot. That time of year it does rain, but sometimes it seemed like 6 to 8 a.m. it would rain hard, and the rest of the day it would be sunny. just for us to get a little penance in our Lenten discipline. But that was good. I can't complain. I could always change my clothes when we got back. Some of the guys from the seminary who lived on the other side of town had to go to class in wet clothes, and they did. They offered it up. We prayed the rosary together on the way to each church. That was a great Lenten practice. And that was really when I learned my way around Rome. My first 6 months, I was often having to refer to a map or take a map with me. After the stational churches each day, you really get to know your way around the whole city quite well. So I had the chance. We had a sign-up sheet if we were interested, and I was able to be the main celebrant at one of those masses at the Church of St. John and Paul, which is from the Roman canon. Saints John and Paul, Cosmas and Damian, and all your saints. So they were martyred on this site. And it's kind of a unique church. If you look there, you can see it was actually the titular church of Cardinal Pacelli, who became Pius XII. So in 1929, when he was made a cardinal, he was entrusted with this church in Rome. Then it was, and continues to be, for several decades, the Cardinal Archbishops of New York have been given the care of this church. So Cardinal Dolan has a connection to this church now. Cardinal Spellman, back in the day, put in these chandeliers, which are from the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. So it's kind of an odd thing, but there they are. And because of that, it became suddenly a popular wedding church. So you see kind of the wedding decor in there, and brides and grooms love to get married there. Much like St. Raymond's. Those of you from St. Raymond's, people love to get married there. So, but it was great to say the Mass there. You're praying Eucharistic prayer number 1 and saying their names, John and Paul, and realizing here we are, right on their tomb. Very special. I also really liked St. Lawrence in Panisperna. There's 4 churches in honor of St. Lawrence. This one is the site of his martyrdom. And here you see some priests and seminarians praying at the site of his martyrdom. And my home parish growing up was St. Lawrence. All my sacraments there. For those of you who don't recall, he was a deacon of the ancient church in Rome. And under I believe that was the Decian persecution in the mid-200s, where he was told, bring us the treasures of the church. He said, well, that's going to take a few days. And so he went about and he gathered all the poor and all the lame, and he brought them and said, these are the treasures of the church. And they didn't like that very much. And then as he was being grilled to death, turned me over. I think I'm done on this side. So trusting in God to the end, and even able to joke and laugh in the face of death. He was a very, very popular Roman saint. Not so much so today. Now St. Anthony is the Italian saint, but in early Roman Catholic history, he was seen as the model saint in Rome, and definitely a great example. So my second or third year, I can't recall, I was able to offer the Mass as the main celebrant for the stational Mass there. That too was very moving. For those of you Shakespeare fans, another fun thing in St. Lawrence Church there is the tomb of St. Crispin. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. Great play, if you haven't read it. So Another wonderful opportunity some of us had, the Shroud of Turin was on display. And I didn't realize this before I went over there, but that doesn't happen very often. So it's usually, kept under safekeeping and not out for public viewing. But it was briefly, and we were able to go on a bus ride for 10 hours each way. We bonded a lot on the bus, just short enough that we didn't quite kill each other on the way back, and fun time for priests to spend together. And we made a pilgrimage, very reverent, very prayerful. So often in Italy, especially southern Italy, things get so noisy and crowded and obnoxious, no personal space and so on and so forth. But this is in northern Italy, and we actually got in a little trouble for jaywalking and acting like Romans in a very ordered city like Torino. But very prayerful 10 or 15 minutes that we got in front of the shroud. For those of you who are less familiar, so these triangular looking patches, actually those are holes because it was folded up and there was a fire and the corners got singed. But the actual image, if you imagine this is about 12 feet long, and in the middle here folds over. So you have Jesus lying on his back with his legs down here in the back of his head, and on this side, the front of his legs, his arms, his face. You can see it a little more clearly looked at this way, front and back. So it's believed by many to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, to give us a glimpse at what his face looked like and his features. Of course, many others think it's a fraud. The main argument to say that it's a fraud is the carbon dating. About 30 years ago, they took off a small piece from the edge of the shroud and dated it to the Middle Ages, 12 or 1300s, I can't recall. And so many have seen that as the definitive proof that this is not really the burial cloth of Jesus. When it comes to these kinds of things, whether it be miracles of the saints or some of these other devotions, they're interesting. I don't see them as essential to our faith. I mean, we have all that we need in Scripture and tradition. If these other things are true, all the better. This one, though, I mean, really, I see a lot of evidence that is fairly compelling. We can explain the carbon dating because it was taken only from the edge, and it's quite possible that it was touched up over the centuries, and that would explain that. What scientists often, some scientists have noticed and others have not dealt with, is there are pollen samples in the shroud. And everywhere where it should have been, like Jerusalem and Constantinople, they find pollen from these places. Now, if you were a forger in the Middle Ages who was trying to trick people into thinking this was the burial cloth of Jesus, you wouldn't be thinking, I've got to go around the world and collect pollen samples because in the 20th century, people are going to be trying to disprove me. So I've got to make sure these get in there. No, I mean, how did they get there? Why are they there if it's not authentic? The other fact that often is ignored is that it is literally a photographic negative. They didn't have cameras back then, so people wouldn't be thinking this way. If I'm going to make a forgery, I'm going to make it to be like a photographic negative. It literally is. It's not painted on. Simply how the image is there is hard to explain. It is there by radiation. And it's very hard to explain how it's there by radiation, unless, of course, you believe that the resurrection did that. Then it's very easy to explain. But, I find that fairly compelling. Also, I think people have pointed out that the facial dimensions match up with a lot of early church icons, which were based on the shroud, some would claim. So there's a lot of other evidence that does point towards it being real. I certainly felt very much like it was real when I was praying in front of it, and found that a very moving experience. And while we were waiting in line and walking around the city, we got to see, this really is a saint factory there in Torino, St. Maximus of Turin, much longer ago, but more recently St. John Bosco and Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati. John Bosco he still is really the patron saint of youth ministry, and Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati often with young adult ministry, both things that are very near and dear to my heart. And John Bosco, during a time when people were very aggressive in their discipline of young people, spare not the rod, was very much an advocate of being gentle and kind and taking a softer approach with them as going a lot further. Pier Giorgio Frassati, no question, was a man's man. He died at the age of 24, I believe, from tuberculosis, but had a full life at the age of 24. Very rugged, very lively man, fun to be around. He was very active in the politics of his day, opposing the fascists who were stifling freedom in Italy. And there's one story about how the police, he and others were peacefully protesting, and the police were kind of threatening and trying to rough them up a little bit, and he took the flagpole that he was waving and used it to defend himself and his friends. Or another time when the fascists sent thugs to his father's house because his father was running a press, printing articles protesting against the fascists, and Pier Giorgio single-handedly persuaded them to leave, we'll say. He was not a wimp. And yet, at his funeral, thousands turned up for this 24-year-old funeral, many of them the poor of the city. He was so kind and generous and loving and radiated so much joy and life to everyone around him in his short life that he made a difference on thousands who out of nine, people were amazed at how many turned up for his funeral. What a difference God makes in our life if we live on his terms, even if it's a short life. So he's a great model. About a month after our Torino trip, some of us made a pilgrimage to Orvieto and Bolsena, which is where Corpus Christi originally happened. And we joined the bishop there for Mass at the cathedral in Orvieto, and then Mass at Bolsena, and a procession all the way through the streets of the city in both towns. The miracle goes back to 1263 in this little town of Bolsena, where there was a priest who had grown rather cynical and lost his faith. And when he was offering Mass, the host bled on the corporal. His faith was restored. And then ever since, this became a celebration now that's of the Universal Church. Every June, we celebrate Corpus Christi and have processions in some places. And so St. Thomas Aquinas himself was commissioned by the Pope to write those famous Eucharistic hymns that we still sing for adoration. Pange Lingua and Tantum Ergo, O Salutaris Hostia. Those were written following this miracle by St. Thomas Aquinas, wrote those songs. I love this in Bolsena. The women there put down these beautiful flower patterns all over the streets where the procession is going to pass. And people might have an hour or two to check them out, but then we walk over them. The idea is Jesus himself walks over them, our Eucharistic Lord. And so they're putting out flowers for the King of Kings to honor his coming through their streets, and they're trampled upon, and that's the end of that. So a very moving display that's really for the Lord and not, showing off, so to speak. Here in Orvieto, you see a lot of the homes put out bunting outside of their windows. Whether they're believers or not, they do this. And it's an amazing thing. You go through the streets, and everybody, the whole town is out for this. It's a very public event. Even though not all of them clearly are devout, most of them have not come to Mass that day. And some of them are drinking beer or wine at their window. Others are, having conversations. Others are clearly bored or annoyed. And others are kneeling devoutly and praying and very much interested in what's going on. And I thought, this is a lot like Jesus himself. He walks through the streets of Jerusalem. Some people couldn't care less who he is. Other people are very much attentive to who he is and what he means for their lives. Other people are actively opposed. All kinds of different human responses. But everybody is impacted by it. That was a moving experience. Of course, one of the first things I did in getting to Rome was go over to the audience hall for an audience with Benedict XVI on a Wednesday morning. And I tried to videotape this. When you're trying to make the sign of the cross while you're holding a camera, it doesn't work so well. But you can see his apostolic blessing there. Adiutorium nostrum in nomine Domini. bishop that took the chair away there is from Milwaukee. He's a priest from Milwaukee who served as prefect of the papal household for several years. Wonderful priest. So that was obviously the first few times you're that close to the Holy Father, and I never did have the joy of meeting him, but was this close to him many times. Always special. And what was I going to say? Yeah, so another opportunity is canonizations. I went to one, then it took me a while before I had the courage to go back again. They're not as glamorous as they sound sometimes, but very special. Here this day there were 5 saints that Pope Benedict declared God has shown us that they're in heaven. So for sure I can remember on the right here, Jan Jugan, the foundress of the Little Sisters of the Poor, and I know several Little Sisters, so that was one of the main reasons I wanted to go. A lot of people have a big devotion to Saint Damien of Molokai, who died as a leper ultimately because he was ministering to the lepers in Molokai, and he's buried back in Belgium where nobody cares about him, but too bad. But and then Saint Zygmunt I mentioned last time. So they're challenging. It was a glorious day, very beautiful, and ultimately a positive experience, but so much pushing and shoving and lack of kindness in the line, even in the communion lines, people being very mean to each other as we're celebrating the love of these saints. So a lot of sad irony in these things. Sometimes you see pilgrims that are so excited to go to the canonization, and you want to just put a little damper on their hopes so that they don't get so devastated and crushed and have a miserable experience. But like I said, overall it was positive, but I didn't rush back to go to another one right away. And I did several times, probably close to a dozen times over the 4 years, take advantage of the chance to give out communion at these papal masses for the big feast days. I love the Vatican umbrellas there they carried up. Sometimes indoors, sometimes outdoors. There too, some of my friends had very negative experiences of this where people were basically being trampled by this stampede for communion, or wanting to grab the ciborium and pass it around and everybody take a host, so I never had that. I had pretty positive experiences of that. And in fact, the best experience was when Pope John Paul II was beatified. I will not be able to be there for the canonization this spring, but was there for the beatification, and it was a beautiful day. And I have to admit, I was expecting the worst, because they were talking about 1 million people being there possibly. It wasn't quite that many, but having experienced unpleasantness at a couple of other events, I thought this one is going to be too much. But I have to go. There's no way that I wasn't going to go. And I put my name in for the lottery we had for a ticket to distribute communion, and God was good to me, and I got that, and it wound up being amazing. The Italians are kind of like some of those Olympic athletes that don't do so well in some of the competitions, but then when it comes to the Olympics, they just always are on their best and really are up for the occasion. And this day was smoothly executed, and especially when I gave out communion right in the middle of the piazza, which was packed with people. It was amazing how they were helping each other out. They were silent, they were reverent, and I had never seen that at a papal liturgy before. Now we might say that's because most of them were Polish, and that's quite possible. But we also could say this was John Paul II clearly praying for the pilgrims, teaching them to love that day. You can see how crowded it was. Even these banners and balloons and stuff, they put them all down during the Mass when they were asked to, and it truly was a prayerful experience. Really had an amazing day. And it was on the Feast of Divine Mercy as well. So this was about halfway through my time in Rome. Our former bishop, Jerome Listecki, some of you might remember him. He was here about 5 years. And when he was made Archbishop of Milwaukee, he received the pallium. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But he's the one who sent me to Rome, and we always got along just wonderfully. Every once in a while, I would give it right to him if I disagreed with him, He was taken aback by that at first, but he learned to like it. But he always never hesitated to give me advice either, and it was usually very good advice. The pallium, probably some of you don't know what that is. Here you see that year there were 3 new archbishops in America, and I don't know how many dozen worldwide. So this wool thing around their neck is the pallium, and it's a sign of their close union with the Bishop of Rome. By the way, here's Archbishop Harvey again from Milwaukee. Great priest. But January 21st, the Feast of St. Agnes, there are sisters in Rome who present lambs to the Pope to be blessed. And then the wool from those lambs is used to make the palliums, or the pallia. And you see the pun here. The Latin agni is very similar to Agnes. Then once those are made, they're placed in a chest next to the tomb of St. Peter, under St. Peter's Basilica there, until the ceremony on June 29th, the feast of Saints Peter and Paul. And then they are placed on the necks of the new archbishops. So that was very moving to see that, and continue to pray for Archbishop Listecki. He has a very difficult job. Another great occasion a few months after that, I'm sure many of you remember Cardinal Burke, who was our bishop for 9 years and who ordained me to the priesthood 11 years ago. And he was made a cardinal there in November of 2010. And that was really a joy to be able to be there for that and celebrate with him that day. He has quite a reputation worldwide. He's almost become like you could say like a comic book superhero in Catholic culture, or villain, depending on who you ask. But larger than life in these blogs. But really, those of us who know the man and who know him well know what a gentle soul he is, how kind he is, how caring he is. I was in seminary for 9 years, and basically, after the first 6 months, he became bishop, and after I was ordained for 6 months, he was moved to St. Louis. So my entire years of seminary formation, he was very much somebody we all looked to as a spiritual father and mentor, and was incredibly loving and kind to me during key moments in my life. I'll never forget that. So it was amazing to see how many people turned up to pay their respects to him as well. So why cardinals? What are they all about? Really, if you want to appreciate who the cardinals are, this is not about a pecking order or some big vertical hierarchy. A lot of people conceive of the church this way, and that's really not how the church is structured. You have bishops and priests and deacons, and that's really it. The Pope himself is a bishop. He's not ordained as Pope. He is already a bishop, or if he's not, then he's ordained Bishop of Rome. And as Bishop of Rome, he has a special ministry as the successor of Peter. Jesus told Peter in the Gospel of Luke to strengthen the brothers. More than any other passage in the Bible, I think that gets to the core of what the Pope is about. As the successor of Peter, his role is to strengthen the brothers. Remember at the Last Supper, Jesus said, "Simon, Simon, the devil has demanded to sift all of you like wheat, but I have prayed for you, so that when you have turned back from your sin, you must strengthen the faith of your brothers." Peter says, "Well, I'll never turn away from you." Yes, you will. But when you turn back, you must strengthen the faith of your brothers. And he does in the Acts of the Apostles. And throughout his life after Pentecost, Peter is constantly strengthening the faith of the church around him. And throughout the centuries, in various ways, many popes have strengthened our faith, strengthened the faith of brothers. Even a lot of Protestants will say they feel their faith is strengthened by the faith of recent popes. So, of course, there's the passage where Jesus tells Peter on the seashore 3 times to feed and tend his sheep. And the most famous one is where Jesus gives Peter the keys and calls him the rock on which the church is built, and gives him authority to bind and loose. That's the one that's most commonly appealed to, and it's an important passage, certainly. But really, as I said, strengthening the brothers in the faith really gets to the core of that ministry, however it's practiced through the centuries. The way St. Ignatius of Antioch described it, this church in Rome presides in love over the other churches. He wrote 7 letters when he was on his way to be martyred. And in many of them, he was really going after the local church that he was writing to. And in the letter to the Roman church, he was very deferential to that church, talking about how they are to preside in love over the other churches, already in 107 AD. St. Irenaeus, about 80 years later, talks about how Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome, and therefore this church has greater authority. And he lists the popes, he lists the successors of St. Peter. That apostolic succession is very important. So that ministry he has. He's the Bishop of Rome, but as such, he has a special ministry to all Christians. And the cardinals then are to help him with that. So cardinal literally means hinge. And back in the day in the early church, these cardinals were priests of Rome. All of the priests in the Roman church and the ones who had charge of the principal churches, the cardinal churches in Rome, gathered to elect the next bishop of Rome and were his advisors and so on and so forth. And that's how this developed over the centuries. So today, the cardinals receive a ring, which is a reminder to them to be faithful to Christ, faithful to his church. And they receive the red hat, the biretta, which is not about showing off, but you look at what the red is about, it's about the martyr's blood. This is the origin of it. And the prayers at that liturgy were so remarkable. Basically, the Pope telling them, be ready to shed your blood for the faith, like Peter, like Paul, like all these Roman martyrs who gave their life in this city. Be strong witnesses to the faith. And that's what the red is about. So a little history here people might not be aware of. In fact, these are all related, the cardinals. The men are called cardinals, who were priests of the Roman Church and who elect the Pope, and they wear red to symbolize the blood of the martyrs. And then in the New World, someone discovered this bird and said, hey, that looks like a cardinal. So the bird is named a cardinal after the color which cardinals wear. And then the baseball and football players also. So there's a lot of jokes about this every time there's a papal election, sending cardinals to Rome to vote for the next pope, or did you hear the Pope got the bird flu, he caught it for one of the cardinals, these kinds of things. But they are all related originally. So over time, there's this growing understanding in the church of all the things that were there in Scripture from the beginning. This special role that Jesus gave to Peter, and this special role in history that God gave to the Roman Church, to realize this is a universal ministry and not only a local ministry. And so the cardinals who advise the Pope and who elect the Pope should be not only from the Roman Church, but there should be some representation from other parts of the world, which at the time was only Europe, and now is much bigger. So there in the Middle Ages, the Council of Basel, there were 24 cardinals at the time. These were the principles that were laid down, that these cardinals should be chosen from all the regions of Christianity, should be men outstanding in knowledge, good conduct, and practical experience, and no more than 1/3 of them from any one nation. Still then, there were always more from around Rome than from other parts of the world. And today, people sometimes complain about how many Italian cardinals there are, but this is not entirely a bad thing. Keep in mind, they are priests of the Roman Church. It makes sense that there is local representation above and beyond the rest of the world, but a balance that also reflects the universal ministry. So today, basically the same principles. We have about 120 cardinals typically. That's the goal number, the target number now. But there's still a lot of those same principles hold for how they're chosen. They do represent all the regions of Christianity. There are no more than 1/3 from any one nation. They are hopefully outstanding in knowledge, good conduct, practical experience. There is always a connection to the Roman Church, though. So I mentioned that earlier. With some of those stational churches and other churches in Rome, there is a cardinal attached to them. They have a titular church. In name, they have this church in Rome, and they're a priest of the Roman Church. And they do oftentimes do renovations. They do a collection back at home and try to fix up the church in Rome, but they're not really the pastor of that church, but they have that connection. It is the priests of the Roman Church who elect the next pope, but among them are representatives from other countries in the world. So fascinating history, and it seems to work as a system. So here you see Cardinal Burke, Pope Benedict putting the red hat on his head, reminding him to be ready to shed his blood for the faith, and he received his titular church in a scroll on St. Agatha in Urbe, is his titular church there. So that was a special day for those of us who knew him. And then the Apostolic Palace then was open to the public, which is very rare, but anybody and everybody could come in and wait in line and greet any one of the 24 new cardinals. And Cardinal Burke's line by far was the longest. And he very patiently spent time with everybody. And my superior in Rome at the house was just amazed. There were about 200 people from our diocese that were there. There were about 20 priests from our diocese. I thought, who's saying Mass back at home? But they must have found somebody to fill in. I'm guessing they had to go out of state. But wonderful day, great celebration. Here's just a little fun picture. Every spring, the Spanish Steps get decked out with flowers. And I played a little Where's Waldo? So I sat down in the middle of the crowd and had somebody take my picture and tried to get people at home to find me. I'm wearing black socks if you're trying to figure out where I am. So, down below is what's called the Piazza di Spagna, which is what one time was a Spanish part of Rome. Then later there were some tea houses that were very popular with English poets like Byron and Shelley. And then up top is actually a French church. So beautiful little part of Rome. Very high rent district now. But I don't know if you found me yet, but I'm moving on. So there's so much I could get into. I'll just share these four at the end here, and certainly understand if you have to go. There's so many saints in Rome, and you feel so close to the saints everywhere you go in Rome. These four in particular, probably others, but I picked these four saints that I was somewhat familiar with before, but really grew in my familiarity with after my time over there, and that was such a blessing. St. Paul particularly, because my first year in Rome was the year of St. Paul, and there were so many events and prayers, and it really felt a closeness to him that year. I tried to go as often as I could down to St. Paul's outside the walls, where he is buried, near where he was martyred and where he is buried. And if you walk it, it's an hour brisk walk from where I was, if you're really moving. So sometimes you try to take the subway. Under the altar is the sarcophagus where his remains are. And I just loved praying there, particularly after 5 years of working in a high school and doing lots of youth ministry, which sometimes is very rewarding, but very often is sowing in tears and hoping that someday this does some good. And really all my efforts being so little in comparison to this amazing missionary. And really all at that point in my life, after the 5 years, I was in many ways feeling very tired, pouring heart and soul into that. And this time in Rome was a great rejuvenating way of being renewed in faith and fervor, and St. Paul was a big part of that. I already showed this slide in the Malta talk, this little grotto in the crypt of the church there, where he was imprisoned in Malta for that winter, after the shipwreck on his way to Rome. And just sitting in this cold, damp cave, pondering St. Paul as a prisoner in chains for the gospel, really was moving for me to do. St. Benedict, I learned a lot about. I vaguely knew about him. I knew he founded the Benedictines and a few other things, but he's one of those saints that's not incredibly popular in many circles, and yet he's the patron of Europe. He's had an immense influence on all of us in Western civilization. And I was called upon to teach a course for students studying abroad in Rome from the University of Mary, and the course was entitled Benedict yesterday and today. So his life and his legacy and his lasting influence. So I learned a lot more about him as I taught about him, and really felt a closeness as we visited those holy sites. I had the chance a couple years previous to go to Norcia, his birthplace. He and Saint Scholastica, his sister, were born there and grew up there. And there's now monks there again. Pope Benedict XVI wanted there to be monks in Benedict's hometown, and he requested it with a close friend of his, and now mostly Americans. There's a foundation there in Norcia again. Now they started a brewery, so that's even better. St. Benedict went to Rome to be educated, and this was still in the late, paganism had not quite died out in Rome at the time, and the Colosseum would have looked similar to this in his day. This was several centuries before the earthquake that made it look like it does now. So he was troubled by what he saw among a lot of his fellow students and the attitude that they were taking towards life. He had this growing desire in his heart to please God alone. St. Gregory the Great wrote the biography of St. Benedict. He said he sought to please God alone. So I love the way that Gregory describes this. Benedict left Rome learnedly ignorant and wisely unlearned. And if you've read the Rule of St. Benedict, you can see this man was very wise and very intelligent, but he chose not to be wise in worldly ways, and he turned a different course. Another incident that led to this, his maid was devastated because of this broken sieve. She was afraid of getting in trouble. And St. Benedict, who wasn't particularly pious just yet, but he prayed, and it was miraculously restored. And then word got around, and he got tempted to be proud and vain of what God had done. And so he fled. He fled the temptation to try to resist that temptation to vanity. He wound up living as a hermit for 3 years, and then a monk for several more years at Subiaco. Wonderful place to visit. It's very hard to get to by public transportation, but this church in the middle of the rugged countryside there, and it was so neat. 2 different courses, or 2 different groups of students I taught, each for about a month, and taking them on a field trip into this grotto, into this cave where Benedict lived as a hermit for those 3 years, and really helping them and myself to appreciate here is where so much of what we have now as Western civilization came from. Those years of solitude as a hermit formed and shaped him, and then he in turn formed and shaped hundreds of monks, which eventually became thousands upon thousands of monks through the generations. And all of Europe for over 1,000 years was heavily molded by the Benedictine monks to form the virtues and the practices of religion that we have and take for granted today. All thanks to this experience that he had there. Special place. He had help, of course, living as a hermit, getting his food. This is always the debate among Benedictines. This neighboring monk, Romanus, found him one day, and he started bringing him food. And the debate is, was Romanus a good monk or a bad monk? Good monk because he was very kind and charitable and bringing food and taking care of somebody in need, but he was stealing food from the refectory, and he was breaking silence. So figure that one out. But the way Gregory describes this, Benedict was alone with himself in God's eyes. Very profound little phrase that has a lot there. Truly with himself. He found his true self through this solitude and prayer, genuine inner peace, and everything in God's eyes. We tend to hide certain parts of our life from God, but Benedict became completely transparent to God and therefore completely found himself in those years of solitude. Of course, word gets out eventually, and he's asked to be abbot of this nearby monastery. But before that, I think, was when he had this temptation to lust. The devil appears to him and tempts him severely towards lust, his response was to roll around in the brambles and subdue that temptation. So the students were, of course, shocked by this. But in the end, even though this is more drastic, it's not that terribly different from what we'll all be doing, hopefully during Lent next week and beyond, where we go to war against pleasures of the sense, and we refuse to be enslaved by them and mastered by them, and we take strong action to make sure that we're free and we're not enslaved by sensual desires. I don't recommend that people do this for Lent, but the general principle is the same. And he was younger yet, so he kind of, this seems to come out in the life of Gregory, that Gregory writes in his rule. He was maybe a little harsh, a little unrealistic in what he was expecting of the other monks, and there's a little more balance that comes out in his rule later in life. So some of them got riled up against him and poisoned his wine. And there's this great story of him blessing the cup, and it shatters, and the wine falls harmlessly to the ground. Through that and other growth, personal growth, he won over virtually all the monks. But there was one who was always jealous of the attention Benedict was getting, jealous at his success and his spiritual growth. Jealousy is always a factor. Even when somebody is holy, other people sometimes are jealous. And this other monk tried to poison his bread. And when he prayed, this raven came and took the bread and took it far away into the rocks where nobody could ingest it. And wonderful description of this event by Gregory the Great, saying, Benedict grieved more for the other priest than for himself. It's a little benchmark of how much Benedict has grown by this point in his life. He's now so detached in so many ways that he's no longer angry. At the poison wine incident, he was still fairly troubled in his heart at the other monks, but by the time he gets to the second attempt, he's purely has a loving concern for the salvation of this other person, and that's his concern, and he's not outraged about the offense against himself. But he does ultimately have to move with the monks. We'll talk about that in a second. But a little amusing anecdote that happened in my own life at this time while I was teaching this course a few months before I arrived here. My friend, Father Tom, now I look back on it, I call it his 11 o'clock freakout. Many mornings, he never really wanted to do a doctorate. His bishop said, you've got to stay, you've got to finish your doctorate in canon law. And many days he felt so overwhelmed and thought, I can't possibly do this. So he'd come by, usually out of sorts, and then we'd sit down and have a cup of coffee and, discuss things, and he'd feel a little better about life. And the reverse, sometimes he did the same for me when I thought I'd never finish or freaked out. So I was cleaning up after the coffee, dropped the mug, and of course my nickname in Rome was El Destructo. My friends call me because I tended to knock things over and break things. Sure enough, I dropped the coffee mug in the sink, and I thought, oh great, another broken. But no, the mug didn't break. The mug was intact, and it broke a hole in the sink. I was laughing, and I normally am not showing a lot of emotion, but I was really showing a lot at that moment, and he saw what? So he came over and looked, and then he was amazed. So I showed this to my students, and one of them said, that's just like a miracle of St. Benedict. I said, no, not quite, but it was definitely amusing. Trying to report it to the maintenance guy in Rome and explain what happened was really hard. And how do you put that in Italian? I don't. Anyway, St. Benedict did have to move on from Subiaco with his other monks. The last straw was when this envious monk tried to tempt the younger monks by sending out these dancing ladies to dance very seductively, and that was the last straw. St. Benedict was willing to tolerate persecution himself, but out of concern for the others, he moved them to Monte Cassino, where there's a monastery to this day. Unfortunately, a monastery that was bombed by the Americans during World War II and invaded by the Polish after the bomb. But the bombing especially was the the sad part. It really did not have to happen that way. Thankfully, not everything was destroyed. But the way that the biography describes it is now he's reached the spiritual heights he's bearing witness to all in the final years of his life. So we were able to offer Mass there at the tomb of Benedict and Scholastica, where they're buried together. And their tomb, thankfully, did survive the bombing. Praise God. So that's still there. And the rest of it's been rebuilt. So St. Gregory the Great has become a real favorite of mine, especially after my time in Rome. Finally, at the end of my time, I was able to say Mass on his tomb, which is in St. Peter's Basilica. And that was very special. There's always a Vatican official that always was having Mass there every morning. I knew him, but yeah. Finally, I just waited around, and the moment his Mass was done, the server and I went and grabbed the altar there. So, you look at his life, he was very bright and talented, studied law initially. He was from a prominent Roman family, and Rome, of course, was not prominent at the time. He became prefect of Rome. We talked about the mess that he inherited, and did his best to help people out. And then felt the calling and became a Benedictine monk at age 36. And he describes those 3 years as a monk as the best years of his life. If he had it his way, he would have just been a monk the rest of his life and been very contented, very happy to pray as a monk, but God had other plans. And the Pope grabbed him and sent him to Constantinople for 7 years as his ambassador. And then when he was back, he was made abbot, but at least he was a monk for 4 years, but then he was elected Pope and very, very reluctantly agreed to be Pope because people pestered him to do so, but really just wanted to be a monk. And you read his writings and you sense this tension. He loves the interior life, he loves the prayer life, but God is always using his other talents to make a difference in the world, and trying to preserve the balance was a constant tension for him. As a diocesan priest, trying to juggle a lot of things, I can totally relate to wanting a strong spiritual life, but also needing to take care of the people. Well, he took care of the people. He constantly was having to deal with barbarian threats that were always renewed throughout Europe. He very much rebuilt structures in Rome that had broken down, set up a system of relief and support for the poor, pooling the resources of people of means around him to do so, sent out missionaries all over, and especially monasteries. We'll return to that in a moment. Wrote letters. There's 3 or 4 volumes of his letters. They're in English now. They're kind of fun to read. Some parts are dull, but then there's very fascinating little snippets in his letters. And commentaries on Scripture that are very profound. He commented on the book of Job and on various Gospels, and especially known for the pastoral rule, which still today priests and bishops read that and really learn a lot about how to be good shepherds and what it means to be a good shepherd. So a phenomenal man at a time when the church really needed one. As Christopher Dawson, a great English historian, put it, above all, Gregory realized clearly that the monastic institution had become an essential organ of the church and the chief hope for the future of Christian culture. This was Gregory's genius. He realized that he was not going to stop the tide. There were so many destructive forces around him. He could manage them a little bit and make a difference for a lot of people, and he did that. But the long-term solution he saw was monastic life. And he established a lot of monasteries, and for about 1,000 years, the Benedictines had a huge influence on all of Europe as a civilizing force, as beacons of light throughout the darkness the Dark Ages were dark in the sense of Europe being overrun by barbarians and all those kinds of problems. And it was the monks who were light and preserved and renewed. Not always, but very often. And Gregory saw that and did that. And something to think about today. There are so many of these forces in our culture where clearly we're losing some of those battles, and we may not win them in the near future. And really we need to pray for vocations to monastic life, vocations to religious life, and think not just of the immediate problems, but of the long term. It's very parallel history, unfortunately, between his days and ours. John Calvin even said he was the last good pope. Saw a lot of good in Gregory the Great. So, I always loved stopping into the church. This was where his family's land was, or overlooking the Circus Maximus, and he gave the land then as a monastery for the Benedictines, and his cell was in the church there, and his chair when he was abbot, and this is where he sent out Augustine of Canterbury to go to England and evangelize. Finally, St. Francis, obviously we're much more familiar with him, most of us, although we maybe were not, because people always think of him as a hippie and environmentalist and animal lover. Whatever. We have a lot of revisionist ideas and not necessarily a deep sense of the real Francis of history. This image, by the way, is in the church at Subiaco, where Benedict lived, St. Benedict lived. It is the oldest image we have of St. Francis, quite possibly painted during his lifetime, because it has on the left here, brother, Friar Francis. It does not say Saint Francis. Very early, both by the people and by the Pope, he was canonized a saint. So this is quite likely painted by somebody who actually knew him, saw him in life. So the photographs are not allowed, but somehow I managed to come up with one. So that's maybe a miracle, I don't know. This is not one I took. Assisi is such an amazing town. If you haven't been there, definitely worth going to. It's so medieval still. It has those meandering medieval streets, or they almost look like alleyways, and non-commercialized. And if you go the right time of the year, not crowded either. It depends on when you're there. But as some priests have described it, he still lives there. I mean, you feel the presence of Francis and Clare while you're there. It's a special town, well worth visiting. And Cardinal Harvey from Milwaukee, this priest I mentioned, he loved Wisconsin, guys. He loves Wisconsin. He loves his home diocese. He would have all the Wisconsin priests and seminarians once a year for a gathering. One year he took us on a bus to Great Show, where Francis had the first nativity scene, which had real people and real animals in it. But ever since, this has become a popular devotion worldwide, obviously. And that started there by St. Francis. And nearby, we went to Fonte Colombo as well that same day. This is where St. Francis wrote the rule for the Franciscans, and a couple of other interesting details from his life. I remember standing at the door of this church, and this friar that was there was talking, and Archbishop Harvey was just dressed kind of like I am, and he was asking, "Oh, so what do you do?" And he said, "Oh, I work at the Vatican." He's like the Pope's personal secretary, but he's just a very humble, simple, unassuming guy that loves Wisconsin and was thrilled to get a couple days not having to be the Pope's gopher. This happened at Fonte Colombo. This is a fireplace. Francis had cataracts on his eyes, and they didn't have laser surgery back then. So they held him down on the bed, and they heated up a poker, and they tried to fix his cataracts. It didn't work. It was great penance for him, and he was very serene through the process. He totally trusted God and was willing to suffer penance for the Lord, and that happened there. And this is very unique. In the chapel there, this Tau cross is very popular among Franciscans, and this particular one, Francis himself painted. So that's kind of neat to stand in front of that and say a prayer, realizing St. Francis painted this with love for our Lord. The real St. Francis, to get a much more in-depth picture of him, we have to understand poverty. I mean, that is the core of what he felt drawn to, what he lived, what he witnessed to. He gave up all his possessions, sold what he had, gave to the poor, followed Jesus with nothing. That was the core of his call, and that's the appeal that he had with so many in his day. But just looking more broad, and this is also is how we understand his love of creation, his love of animals, his love of plants. If you go to any of those sites I just showed, and you look around, spectacularly beautiful. The man was drawn to beauty, always, in other people, in the earth around him, but in a very unique way. The way one priest I know described it, Francis looked around him or looked at someone or something beautiful and said, "That's beautiful," and was filled with gratitude to God for making the beauty. Whereas so many of us say, "That's beautiful, I want it," and we try to take it for ourselves. We can't simply enjoy God's beauty and give it back to Him. We always want to keep a little for ourselves. Francis witnessed so beautifully in that way, never taking for himself, never possessing, always giving back to the Lord with gratitude. Poverty, to understand him, that poverty is so important, and that's what made him so joyful. Always, he and the brothers around him, and the sisters in St. Clare who followed as well, so filled with joy, so marked with joy, because they were not weighed down by the misery of attachments to this world. Pope Francis, I think, has been witnessing very strongly to these exact principles. He's been trying to recall these things that St. Francis witnessed to. One that is so often missed. If you want to understand St. Francis, you have to understand his love of Christ on the cross, Christ crucified. He always was meditating on Jesus' suffering on the cross. You saw the cross that he painted, reminding his brothers about the cross. And he received the stigmata. He was one of the earliest saints we know of to receive the wounds of Christ because of his close attachment to Christ on the cross. And when he was persecuted by church officials, or when he suffered things like having a poker in his eye, he suffered courageously. The prayers at the Mass of St. Francis, if you pray the votive Mass at his tomb, are filled with references to his love for the cross. Likewise for Christ's sacred humanity. So he was the one who popularized the Nativity creche that now has spread throughout the world, and the Stations of the Cross. And many Franciscans still pray the Stations daily. And we certainly pray them during Lent. Francis really encouraged that devotion, and in fact he went to the Holy Land and walked in the footsteps of Jesus. His main purpose in going to the Holy Land was to be martyred. He wanted to be a witness to Christ in martyrdom, but he won over many of the Muslims, not necessarily as converts, but they were so taken with this amazing human being and his witness that to this day Franciscans have charge of the churches in the Holy Land. So that these shrines at these holy sites are run by Franciscans because of St. Francis himself having such a positive relationship with the Muslims he met in Jerusalem. Then there's that great prayer of St. Francis, which is not the one you're thinking of. We've all heard that, "Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there's hatred, let me so love." Beautiful prayer, theologically rich. I encourage you to pray it. It's not written by St. Francis. It's about 100 years old. It's a great one, but it didn't show up until 1912 in France, as far as we know. There's a prayer that St. Francis did write in front of the cross of San Damiano. Those of you who know the story, Jesus spoke to him from this cross, which you can still see today in the Church of St. Clare, and said, "Francis, rebuild my church," which he physically started doing, and eventually figuratively rebuilt Christ's church. And in front of that cross, this is the prayer that Francis prayed, and we'll close with that. "Most high and glorious God, enlighten the darkness of my heart. Give me, Lord, a correct faith, a certain hope, a perfect charity, sense and knowledge, so that I may carry out your holy and true command. Amen." Thank you. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.